Alright, hi everyone. I hope you guys are doing well. So this is actually going to be our last lecture video of the semester. I will also be posting a review video for exam 4. But this video is going to cover the information from chapter 16, and this is the lecture video for the week of April 20th. Yes, I've said this a few times before. I will say this again. It's unfortunate that we had to wrap up the semester with dying, but hopefully we can have the most optimistic, upbeat conversation about death that's potentially possible today. So we will have an activity this week if you need more activity points. Remember that I'm keeping your top 10 activity grades. So if you're happy with 10 activity grades you already have, then you don't have to complete activity 12. But if you need more activity points, this is your last chance. Email me if you have any questions about that. And then we're going to have exam 4. Exam 4 will not be proctored. So when you listen to the review video, just ignore anything where I say proctored exam. There will not be a password. If you have any issues with the timing, also please let me know as soon as possible. If you're worried about your internet connection, I know some people have had internet issues because of campus closing down, that kind of thing. So let me know about that. But exam 4 is going to be multiple choice, true, false matching. It will cover the material from the 4th section of the class. After you take exam 4, I'll post your grade in the class, and if you're happy with that grade, you're done. You can keep it. You don't have to take the final exam. If you would like to take the final exam, it could potentially boost your grade. So I'm going to drop your lowest exam grade. For those of you who have missed an exam, I would definitely recommend the final exam because it would be replacing a 0. If you've had an exam that was especially low, then the final exam could also be helpful there. Feel free to email me after I post your grades after exam 4 if you have questions about whether or not the final could help you. Essentially, with the final exam replacing your lowest exam grade, however many points higher you score on the final exam than your lowest exam grade, you'll have that many points added into your points total. So I'm going to add up your top 10 activities, your top 4 exams, and any extra credit that you have to determine your grade in the class. Now remember that students will not receive credit for the class regardless of the grade they have if they don't verify their identities. Initially, the plan was to have you do that through exam 4 as a proctored exam, but plans have to change. So because of that, now we have the authentication videos. Please make sure that you are submitting that assignment, and please let me know as soon as possible if you're having any issues with that assignment. Okay? If you have any questions, let me know. I'm going to go ahead and get into our last lecture video. Alright, so as I said, today we're going to be talking about dying and bereavement. This is definitely a difficult topic to discuss and not necessarily the most pleasant thing to have as our last lecture video, but a very important discussion to have. So first of all, we need to recognize that there are different definitions of death, and this can vary, first of all, from culture to culture. So we live in an individualistic culture. Other cultures live in more collectivist cultures where they tend to think more about other people than they do about themselves. Certainly they have cultural norms or social norms about what most people would say or feel or think about a certain issue. One thing that is interesting is a criteria for a good versus a bad death. And this is something that if we had an in-person class would be interesting to have a discussion about. What makes for a good death? Of course, we would say, well, we don't want anyone to die. Death is not ever good, but then within the realm of death, dying for someone that you care about, dying for a greater cause, or dying at the end of a long, happy life where you have accomplished your goals and poured into other people. You can see that there could be some deaths that could be viewed as more positive than negative. But then definitely from culture to culture, and then maybe with different demographics within a culture, there are differences about funerals. How do we handle a funeral? Is it a sadder event, or is it more of a celebration of life? Is this something that we do right after a person dies, or do we wait a certain amount of time after death, that kind of thing? It talks about icons here. So there are certain symbols that can be associated with death, and that varies from culture to culture, and the meaning of those as well. Views about how long a person should grieve and what that grieving should look like and how other people should be involved and all the food that gets brought over when someone passes away. And then it talks about the afterlife. This is something that would vary from culture to culture, but I would say also would vary a good bit based on your religious beliefs about what happens after death. So there are certainly differences in cultural definitions of death, But what about some legal and medical definitions? So traditionally, we have thought of death as being a lack of heartbeat and respiration. So this person is not breathing on their own, the heart's not beating, this individual has passed away. Having said that, though, today we have a more complicated definition, and we'll talk about the reason why we might need a more complicated definition in a second. But today we would have several different criteria that would need to be met. So no spontaneous movement to stimulation. So if you're running something across someone's foot, for example, is there some kind of movement associated with that? No spontaneous respiration, so they're not breathing on their own. This may be someone who has machines that are keeping them alive, but they're not able to do these functions on their own. No eye movements, no swallowing, yawning, vocal or postural activity, so they're not maintaining any kind of muscle rigidity. They're not having these reflexive actions here, as well as motor reflexes are not there. EEG has not changed for at least 10 minutes, and we could potentially check it for longer than that, but we're having at least 10 minutes where that's not changing. And this is something that we would test and then retest later. If any of these things had changed within 24 hours, then we would likely say this is a situation where we need to monitor further before we made any permanent decisions. Now, the reason why we need to have more complicated criteria here, first of all, it is possible that a person might have a condition that mimics death that they could still potentially come back from, given enough time or given appropriate medical treatment. So we need to make sure we've ruled out those conditions. But then also there is a pretty significant ethical debate here about what it means to actually be dead. So if we're thinking about brain activity, are we thinking about just the cortex? So if there's no cortical activity here, you don't have these higher processes. So this person is not thinking, that kind of thing. However, the brainstem is another part of the brain that has more basic functions. So things like breathing, for example, swallowing. So what if we have a person who is in a vegetative state where there's no cortical functioning, and we don't think that's ever going to come back? There's not going to be any higher order functioning. However, the person's brainstem still has some activity. So maybe they're able to still keep their heart beating and that kind of thing. So some reflexes might be there. The person is meeting some criteria, but not all criteria. In that particular case, a person is not likely to get better. However, we're not expecting them to get worse either. We're in a situation here where we have to then decide, should we remove the support, the machines that we have providing support here? What should we do for an individual who is not likely to get better, but then also still has some brainstem activity? And of course, there are many different layers to this argument. I think it essentially boils down to ethical and moral dilemmas. And when you're thinking about the difference between ethics and morality, I mean, ethics is usually decided by a committee, by an association. The ethical question is, am I going to get sued, perhaps? But the moral question is, laying in your bed at night, is this right, is this wrong? You determine your own views on morality here. So certainly this is a complicated issue. And so because of that, we've got this new field, bioethics, basically studying the relationship between values and the technological advances that we have. These advances are great, they're fantastic in a lot of ways, but they do create some new ethical situations. Like, now we have technology to keep this person alive, but should we keep this person alive? And so this is one thing we're going to talk about later, but you will have a person who will be having to then make these decisions for you, perhaps. If you are alive but not in a position to be able to make these decisions, then a spouse or a parent or some other relative is going to be making these decisions for you. So you have to think about their wishes. What wishes did you express? I mean, this is not a pleasant conversation, but not a bad idea to have this conversation with people you care about what they would want to happen if something like this were to happen. So we're trying to balance out continuing to keep this person alive has its benefits, but it also has its costs. Like, what is the harm that we're doing to this individual by maintaining this life. And so certainly this is a really complicated decision that has spiritual aspects to it, medical aspects, legal aspects, a very complicated decision. And if you want to think about how much goes into these decisions, then you could do some research on cases where there's been kind of a media following. If, for example, a partner is trying to make a decision about whether or not to end the life of their partner, and then family members disagree with the spouse about how that should happen, certainly this can be a very drawn out, very difficult situation. When we're thinking about ethics and morality surrounding ending a person's life, then the topic of euthanasia comes up. So generally speaking, when we're talking about euthanasia, one definition here, a merciful ending of life. Once again, a lot of legal, medical, spiritual issues that come up with the idea of mercifully ending someone's life. But essentially there's this dilemma of if a person is being kept alive by a machine, or if a person is suffering from a terminal illness and they are not likely to get better and maybe potentially in pain, then what should we do in that particular situation, especially if that person has expressed a desire to end their life? So we are going to talk about physician-assisted suicide in a second, but thinking about euthanasia, we're not talking necessarily about physician-assisted suicide, because with euthanasia, we're going to have someone else administering the treatment that's going to end a person's life. And certainly it is difficult. I just want you guys to recognize it is difficult to teach this lecture. And it's probably difficult for a lot of you to listen to it as well. So we have to consider the morality then of intentionally ending someone's life. That seems immoral. If someone is terminally ill, administering whatever the drug is that is going to end that person's life, but then also, if I let the person's going to die, but if we let them live longer, then they'll suffer more. This is a complicated situation, and not one that there are easy answers to. So when we're talking about euthanasia, there's a distinction here, and then some might argue whether or not this really is a distinction. But talking about active versus passive euthanasia, with euthanasia, you are ending a person's life. With active euthanasia, you're deliberately ending the person's life. You're actively giving them something that will cause them to die. On the other hand, passive euthanasia is also ending the person's life, but doing it by withholding treatment. So if there's a treatment option that could potentially save the person's life and you withhold it, then that's technically euthanasia as well. So what if the client then says they don't want a treatment? And we'd say, okay, well, that's a decision that's made by the individual. Well, what if the individual is a child? So there's a lot of ethical things that can come up in this particular discussion. There's also the question here, is there a difference really? Administering a medication that will end a person's life, is that different from withholding a treatment that would extend a person's life? Is there actually a difference here? And I don't have the answer for that. Once again, morality, religious beliefs, I perhaps know how I feel about it, but I'm not going to talk about my personal opinions in this lecture. But I would encourage you to think about your personal opinions. Now, euthanasia is different from physician-assisted suicide, in that with euthanasia, we're talking about another person who is causing that individual to die. With physician-assisted suicide, the patient or client, whatever word you prefer, is the one who is administering it to themselves. So the doctor would give a prescription, and then the client would decide when or if to take that prescription. So the doctor makes the overdose, essentially we're talking about an overdose here, makes the overdose available, and then the client decides when to use it, if to use it. Now, there are certain requirements here for this. It has to be a terminal illness, have to talk about what we could do, other options, have to have multiple doctors, I would think, but I would imagine that the laws also vary from state to state, which we'll talk about in just a second. But Usually I would think you'd have to have multiple doctors assess the person to make sure that it truly is a terminal illness, and then the person has to be ruled as being mentally competent, and then the person has to make multiple requests, and so there are these series of rules. Now it talks about Oregon and Washington. They were the first 2 states to pass laws allowing this. But one thing to note is that just because it's allowed does not mean it's required. So my understanding is that doctors in those states could decline to be part of it. So it's an option for them, but not something they have to do. So a sick individual does not have a constitutional right. My understanding of it is to this. It has to be something that a doctor agrees to do. But Oregon and Washington were the first states, but since that time, California, Colorado, Hawaii, Vermont, and D.C. Have also passed laws allowing this. And I believe there's at least one other state that's considering it or has it kind of tied up in legal issues right now. So certainly this is something that is debatable about whether this is something that we are morally and ethically okay with. There's an argument to be made on both sides. Is it okay to allow a person to end their life, to make that available to them? Does this condone suicide? Then the other question is it okay to leave a person to suffer if we have another option? Once again, really complicated. And a lot of moral, ethical, personal issues to consider there as well. As far as a life course approach, thinking about how our approach to death changes as we get older, we've already talked about the fact that as we get older, our cognitive processes advance. And so older individuals are able to think more abstractly than younger individuals. And therefore, your view of death will change a little bit based on the stage of life that you're in. But also, not just that, but the experiences that you've had with death. And, of course, it's difficult to lose anyone that you care about. But one thing is that it's not just difficult because you lose that person. It's also difficult because then you have to face the issues of thinking about your own death and death of other people that you care about. It talks here about having a parent pass away is difficult in its own right for its own reasons, but then also you start thinking about what it will be like for your kids perhaps if you were to pass away, that kind of thing, or when you will. So one thing that is surprising is that older adults, generally speaking, are less anxious about death, more accepting, more resigned to the fact perhaps than younger individuals. So the process of dying varies greatly. Some individuals have no warning whatsoever. Some have quite a bit of warning. It talks about the fact that some diseases might have a terminal phase where you fought the disease for quite some time and now you know that there's nothing else to do and you have some idea of how much time you have left. But there may be other situations where a person might have a health condition that is likely to end their life, but they have no real way of predicting when that might happen. Like, for example, if an individual has an aneurysm, then they might know that that is a very dangerous situation that could certainly result in death, but not knowing, and this is assuming that there's not anything they can do to operate and that kind of thing, but they might not know when that particular situation might occur, that they might eventually die. And so that also changes things for the individual trying to deal with this diagnosis. So when you think about death, certainly there have been different theories about death. We're going to touch on a couple. First of all, one you've probably heard would be the 5 stages of death. So Elizabeth Kubler-Ross had these stages of the dying process, and she suggested that there are 5 emotional stages. So these are emotional, and she has them in a particular order, but you should know that they can overlap. A person could perhaps go back to an earlier stage. Some stages last for a very long time. Some might go through pretty quickly. So this is going to vary a lot from person to person. But essentially the 5 stages: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. So the individual probably has some shock, like, I didn't think this would ever happen to me, there must be a mistake, this is someone else's test, you've messed up the results, I need to go find another doctor. And there's nothing wrong with getting a second opinion, of course, especially on an issue like this. But that may be denial in the beginning, and then anger, like, this isn't fair, other people don't have to deal with this. And then bargaining, which might then lead to, okay, I'm going to look for a different doctor, I'm going to research different treatment options, I'm going to find a way to get around this, that kind of thing. There are lots of different ways that an individual might try to look for a way out of this. If an individual feels like they were not successful in that pursuit, that can lead to symptoms of depression, which may or may not actually be severe enough to meet criteria for diagnosis of depression. And then what we often see is an acceptance. It talks about peace and detachment, kind of having a more like logical, this is going to happen to everyone, I want to make sure I'm prepared, kind of make some decisions and plans now, that kind of thing. It's really helpful for someone to have people to talk to, and that can be friends and family members, but it could also be a therapist, counselor, could be, I would imagine, very helpful. An issue that I would say is there for most of us would be death anxiety. So anxiety in general is this response, usually we think about physiological response, your heart is racing, you're hyperventilating. There's a cognitive aspect to it as well that happens because of something that is not necessarily immediately threatening us, but a potential threat. And so the idea is that death is hanging over all of us, although we spend most of our time ignoring it, but it is there. Terror management theory is a theory of motivation. Like, if we talk about motivation, that's what drives your behavior, why you do what you do. And this is a theory that says that essentially, whether you realize it or not, everything you do is to avoid dying. So let's think about that. Then you go to school and get an education so you can get a job, so you can get health insurance, so you can go to the doctor so you won't die. Or so you can make money, so you can buy medication, pay for a doctor so you won't die. I mean, essentially that you develop relationships because it's good for your mental health and good for your physical health so you won't die. Like, everything you do is to avoid death, whether you realize it or not. Therefore, younger individuals should reject the company of older individuals because it reminds them that they will someday be older themselves. I cannot believe I am about to quote Warm Bodies here. Zombie movie. Not my usual forte. However, there was a scene where there's some varying, stick with me here, okay? Some varying levels of zombie decay. And the zombies who were in worse shape were talking to the zombies who were in better shape and saying, and I essentially quote here, "What you are, we once were, and what we are, you will be." Okay. Long drawn out way of saying that we look at someone who is nearing death and it scares us because we know it will come for us as well. And we look at someone who is older and we know that at one point they were where we are and we will one day be where they are, and that is something that scares us, and therefore we try to distract ourselves from it, or at least that's the theory here. Now, one thing to note is that men and women might experience death anxiety differently. You guys forgive me for making a reference to a zombie movie. Men might have more death anxiety than women, generally speaking. However, women might be fearful of the dying process. I think probably this has to do with the relational component, women being more concerned about how their family members might be impacted by their dying process, or how they won't be able to take care of other people could potentially be part of that. So, one thing that can help people feel more prepared would be having these end-of-life issues resolved. So things like, do I want to be cremated? Do I want to be buried? If I'm going to be buried, where do I want to be buried? Setting up a will, having made some arrangements for what will happen, and feeling like you have then set things up the way that you wanted them. So one thing that we see, it talks about the baby boomer generation, so thinking about a lot of individuals getting older at the same time, tend to be more proactive about this, tend to be perhaps taking care of this earlier. than others do. Of course, this is a complicated thing to be thinking about, especially if you have a parent who is making these decisions now and setting things up. Then they might have to have some uncomfortable conversations with you as their child, and so certainly this is hard. But essentially, a final scenario is letting other people know what you want to happen. And since you never know when something might happen to you or to people that you care about, it's not a bad idea to have this conversation about how you would want things to play out if something were to happen. Now, if an individual has a health condition that is terminal, then there are different options about how they might get health care. A person might stay at home if that's an option, if they're able to get their needs met there, or in a hospital or a nursing home. But hospice is something else that we might think about. Of course, with any of these options, you have to weigh what will insurance cover, how much does it cost, that kind of thing. The great thing about a hospice is that it can focus on helping a person be free of pain and trying to reduce any negative psychological things, not necessarily trying to delay death or to give the person treatment that will help them live longer, but more giving them treatments that will help them be more peaceful, more comfortable, helping them make the most of the time that they have left. As I would imagine, it would be very difficult probably to work in a hospice setting, although this is work that needs to be done, and certainly I commend people who are able to do it well, but I can imagine that that would be really, really difficult. We're talking about making decisions about what you want to happen at the end of life. Talks about some different legal issues here, having a living will, so making sure that you have an idea about life support, other treatments that you want. If you have kids that are still in your care, who do you want to take care of your kids if something were to happen to you and any other caregivers that they currently have? It talks about a power of attorney. So this is something that you could specify. This is the person I want making these decisions for me. But then if you don't have a specified power of attorney, then another family member would end up making these decisions, and so a spouse or a parent or whatever the case may be would end up making these decisions for you. So that's why it's a good idea to let people know your wishes. Now, when it talks about organ donation here, this is something that you can indicate on your driver's license if you want to be an organ donor. But then there may be some, even within that realm of you say, yes, I do want to be an organ donor, there may be some organs that they take automatically and some that then have to be decided by family members. And so letting the people who would be making these decisions know your preference on that would be really helpful. Sometimes you hear people, if you know individuals who are going through these situations, or if you watch medical television shows, you hear about a DNR, do not resuscitate. The idea is that a person might be in a medical setting and they're receiving some types of treatment, but there are certain types of treatment they don't want. So if they say, I don't want any extraordinary measures, if my heart stops beating, if I stop breathing, then just let me go, don't bring me back. So that's something that a person would have to sign and make sure that they have taken all the proper legal precautions there for that, and then letting everyone that's involved know, which includes your medical personnel, but then also family and friends, what you want, making sure that you've taken care of all of the paperwork for that. Now, as far as the grieving process is concerned, what I do want to say is that this is different from person to person and situation to situation, and that's okay. Some terms here, bereavement is a person struggling because they've lost someone. So you are bereaved for a certain amount of time after a death. And then, of course, there are cultural differences in how long you expect a person to continue to be experiencing bereavement. Grief would be the emotions that come after suffering a loss. So the fact that you have lost someone, you say, I'm in a state of bereavement, that's the situation I'm in, and I'm experiencing grief, I'm experiencing these emotions. Now, one thing to note is that we have cultural views about mourning, culturally approved ways of expressing grief. So how much time should a person spend mourning? How much should a person cry? How long should a person wear dark clothes? How long should a person stay at home before they start doing certain things? So that is very different from culture to culture. And some people do mourning differently, and they don't necessarily do it the way other people in their culture do. So the grief would be the emotions that we feel, and then we need to find a way to cope with those emotions. So one thing is that you'll see, you may be denying the reality of the loss. It doesn't feel real to you yet. You keep thinking this is going to be a nightmare that you're going to wake up from. And then once you do acknowledge that, then there's a lot of emotions a person has to work through that they should not have to work through alone. So making sure they have friends, family, counselors, someone to talk to. Adjusting to the environment. So if you were living with the person, then you have to make decisions about their belongings and how long are you going to leave things the way they were when the individual passed away. And there's a lot of difficulties here. Am I going to stay in this location, or am I going to move to a different location? I talked about loosening ties. This is something that should be done gradually and should not, I will say, should not be forced on someone if they're not ready for them, but kind of allowing themselves to have a life afterwards can be helpful at a certain point when a person is ready for that, but it's not something that should be forced on them, because grief is a process. I was recently talking with someone who has a family member who's gone through something and was grieving, and there's a concern about how long should this person be grieving, and my answer is let them feel what they feel. That grief is not something that we have a textbook on, and I'm sure we do have textbooks on it. That's not my point. My point is there's not a manual on it's okay to grieve for this long and then you need to move on. So let the people grieve the way they need to grieve. Give them the time to grieve. It depends on the relationship and the manner of an individual passing away, but it's a hard thing. And also the way that we frame it, the way we talk about it, it's not that we get over it or that we recover from it or I am now back to where I was before. It's more like we internalize it, we make peace with it as much as we can, and we learn to live afterwards. Not necessarily that we ever fully recover from that loss, and we shouldn't expect people to. We should allow people to vary in their grief and the intensity, which may come and go, or may be very intense in the beginning and then later less intense, or less intense in the beginning and then later more intense. There are different emotions that people can feel, and that's okay. It talks about the most common being sadness, denial, anger, loneliness, guilt. But there are lots of emotions that can be involved, and that's okay. It would be really helpful for a person to talk with a psychologist and to work through grief. Because as you're going to see coming up, there can be symptoms of depression or even symptoms of post-traumatic stress that can come along with losing a person. And so making sure that a person is not left alone to deal with that on their own, giving them space and time. If you don't know what to say, that's okay. Tell them, like, I don't know what to say. I love you. I care about you. I'm here for you. What do you need? Do you need me to come over more or come over less? Do you need me to give you some space, or what do you need? And giving a person whatever they need in that particular situation is great. But one thing to note is that it's not just about the initial event, but then also about the anniversary of the event or other important days. If you've lost a spouse, then thinking about not just the anniversary of that spouse's death, but then marriage anniversary, all the other special days that can be really hard as well. So as far as themes of grief here, coping is the actions a person takes in response to the emotion. So whether they isolate themselves or whether they keep themselves busy, whether they take up a hobby or they find somebody to talk to, which was much better idea than isolating yourself. But whatever it is that you do to deal with grief, and there are some things that are more positive than others here. Affect is talking about emotions. So what do you feel on a day-to-day basis on average, and also what do you feel when you're reminded of the event, when there's some kind of trigger there. Life-changing both in positive and negative ways, and being okay with that change. The stories that you tell about a person, so making sure that you continue to honor that person and remember that person and think about that person, and that's okay, and that's a good thing. But then also the continued relationship. So it talks about the survivor here, the person who has lost someone will then have to think about the ties, how closely they want to remain tied to that person. Like, how often are they going to go visit the cemetery that the individual is buried in, that kind of thing. Like, are they going to change where they live and the possessions of the person that they lost? Like, those are things that are difficult decisions that need to be made by that person. And they need to be supported in that. So normally when we think about grieving, we think about the emotions and the behaviors that follow. But what about your physiological reactions? What about changes in the body? Losing a spouse can cause sleep issues, which could be related to a lot of different things, but could potentially just be if you're used to sleeping with someone in the bed with you, then that can be really hard for you. Nightmares can be involved, that kind of thing. But it talks about other neurological problems, so it can be memory issues, that kind of thing, circulatory problems. So a person, if you lose a spouse, you're at an increased risk of passing away yourself. So illness, maybe not going to the doctor, not taking good care of yourself. Depression can happen. Now, you could debate whether depression is a psychological problem or physiological problem. Maybe it's some of both. There's certainly a lot of evidence to suggest that there is a physiological component. But when it talks about severe depression, SSRIs and other medications can be very helpful here. Now, as I briefly mentioned a second ago, grief is normal and it's a process and it's different for each person, but sometimes it can become an issue. It talks here about separation distress. This is something that can be almost depression-like. Like, there's a severity here. It's been going on for an extreme period of time, or the symptoms are very traumatic. It's causing some dysfunction here. And it could also look like PTSD. So there can be a traumatic component to it. I'm traumatized by the loss. So having flashbacks, having nightmares, trying to avoid anything that reminds you of that person, detaching yourself from someone else. So while it is good to let a person grieve the way they want to grieve, it's also good to make sure that they have the resources they need if they're continuing to struggle for a prolonged period of time. Now, how do we view death during different parts of our lives? Well, kids don't really understand death. It talks about preschoolers thinking of death as temporary, something that the person will come back from, like so-and-so died and we went to the funeral, but we keep thinking that that's going to be over now and they'll come back. As kids get older, they start to understand that death is permanent, but still might not necessarily totally understand death. And this is an argument about video games and things that involve killing someone in a video game, and then the next time you restart the game and they're there again. And so perhaps we're creating this idea that kids are confused potentially about death, and there's a whole nother debate about whether we should have violent video games. That's a whole other conversation. As kids get older, they might start to develop some positive or some negative ways of coping. Their way of coping will probably be modeled by the coping of people they see. So being aware of that. It's normal for kids, just like adults, to go back and forth between normal, I'm totally fine, everything's okay, and experiencing grief. This happens not just with kids, but with older adults as well. As you move into adolescence, I don't know whether you guys consider yourself an adolescent or not, probably not, but if you're thinking about the college years, this is a time when many individuals lose a family member, perhaps for the first time. Oftentimes this could be a grandparent or other older family member, but could also be a friend, that kind of thing. Oftentimes we see people have very negative reactions to their first experience with death, and then they learn how to cope with it. And so this is something that can improve over time, but you can see things like guilt, self-esteem. This is especially difficult if you're working, if you're in school. This can impact your ability to cope. Potentially substance abuse, relationship problems, even thoughts about hurting yourself. So definitely something to keep an eye on, individuals who are struggling through the loss of a family member. What if you are thinking about someone who died during adulthood? That's something, if you're thinking about young adulthood, it's usually a shock, it's a surprise, we're sad because we feel like a person has missed out on a lot of things that we felt like they were entitled to. And because it is a shock, if you lose someone who is in young adulthood, It talks about especially a partner here. This is something very unexpected. We don't think about being widowed during young adulthood. And so perhaps because of that, and because we may be alone, not having that social support, then this grief can last for quite some time. And that's fairly typical. Although losing a spouse at any point in time is really difficult. And then having to make decisions about should I date again, get remarried. These are things that are really, really difficult. Continuing on talking about things that are difficult, what if you lose a young child? So we think about the fact of losing a parent or a grandparent is something we expect. Hard, but we expect that we will probably live longer than our parents and grandparents. But what if you lose a child? It talks about SIDS here, but there's certainly plenty of situations where an individual might lose a child. Sometimes we could be thinking about miscarriage. We could be thinking about a loss of a child, stillbirth, or a child that passes away shortly after delivery, or a SIDS situation. Unfortunately, sometimes we expect people to move on from this differently than if they were to lose an older child. We think that because that child wasn't in your life as long, we somehow, for some reason, expect that to be less traumatic. It is still traumatic. And someone who has lost a pregnancy, lost a child, this is something that is not something you're going to recover from. It's something that's very, very difficult, very challenging. It talks about marriages potentially being at risk here because of the severity of the mourning and the difficulty of moving forward from that. So this is something that if you have someone in your life who has been through this horrible situation, make sure you continue to take care of them, care for them over time. Don't expect this to be something that they move through quickly. What if you are an older individual who's lost a young adult child? This is something that can also be very stressful, as you can imagine. You don't expect to outlive your children, and so being, middle-aged and losing a young adult child, whether it be to illness or accident or whatever the case may be, in addition to all the things you can imagine, it also, research suggests that it can cause problems with surviving siblings. So you want to keep your other children close to you, but it's hard to have them close to you with one missing. And so it can be really difficult for family gatherings, and things like that can continue to be very stressful afterwards. So the essential theme through this lecture is that it's hard to lose someone in any stage of life. Losing a parent is something that can be really stressful because this is someone that you've obviously spent a lot of time with, someone that you care about. But then also it talks about losing a buffer between ourselves and death. So thinking that you expect to have your parents pass away before you do, but then when your parents pass away, you think, well, it's going to be my turn next. The next generation will be the next ones approaching death. And so because of that, and because you lose that support that you had, that can be really, really stressful. However, what if you were caring for that parent? There can almost be a sense of both relief and guilt here, feeling like now I don't have to take care of this person, I don't have to watch this person suffer as much, and so that can cause a lot of really complex emotions. It talks about Alzheimer's disease. I did have a grandparent pass away from Alzheimer's disease, and so I understand when it talks about the second death, the idea that when they start to have that severe dementia, you mourn them then, even though they're still there. Because they are physically still there, but mentally they're not the same person they used to be. And then when they pass away, then you mourn them again. So it's almost like you've gone through that process twice. However, as we get older, people have probably had more experience with death. They've developed better coping skills. And so perhaps because of that, we see older individuals reporting less anxiety, being more accepting of death. Especially people who feel like they're happy with the way life turned out. So now is the time maybe for you to be making decisions now that you will be happy with later in life, so that you won't experience some distress later. If you feel like I've lived a good life and I'm happy with how I spent my time and my energy, then this could be a positive thing. Alright, last couple things here. Obviously, losing anyone is hard. What if you are an older parent who has now lost a child or grandchild in later life? Then that's going to be really difficult. It talks about how they often report that relationship as being the closest they ever had. Sometimes when you lose someone, it changes the way you think about them. You know, people tend to speak positively of individuals after they've passed away. We view things differently because it helps us make peace with that. And so that's something we can see here. But then also, if you're a grandparent who's lost a grandchild, then you also, not only have you suffered, but you have to watch your child suffer, and then trying to support your child and maybe not grieve in front of them because you don't want to make their grief worse. Like, there's a lot of layers of difficulty to that, which would certainly make for a really, really hard situation. What about the death of a partner? Different cultures view this differently. In our culture, we usually expect a person to mourn and then move on and remarry, and that's kind of what we expect. We think that people who have been widowed for quite some time and then have not entered a new relationship, we tend to think of that as being a little bit odd. But I think we should give people definitely the time and space, and if they don't want to remarry, that's perfectly fine as well. One thing that you will see is that it depends on the person's mental status as far as whether they view that person very positively. So individuals who are depressed and have lost a partner are more likely to say our relationship was fantastic and that person was fantastic. Maybe because they're depressed, they're focusing more on what they've lost. Whereas people who are not depressed might focus a little bit more on the negative, like they're trying to encourage themselves, like, I can move on, I can live without. If you focus too much on the positive things that you've lost, it makes it hard to move on. So different people can view this differently based on their mental health as well. Alright, so on a sunnier note, because I couldn't change the order we covered the topics in, death had to come last, but I wanted our last activity to be a little bit more positive. For your last activity, I want you to just kind of summarize what you've learned this semester. What have you heard that was interesting? What stood out to you? What topics did you think were especially useful for you in this stage of your life? So that's what I want you to be thinking about for activity 12. Now remember, you do get 2 drop grades for activities. So you can only get 100 points total. I'm going to keep your top 10 activity grades, and if you've got 10 out of 10 on the 10 activities, then you'll have 100 points already. But if you missed an activity or didn't get full credit on an activity, this could be a chance for you to earn those points back. And I'll be emailing you after you take exam 4 with more details about the final exam. So I've enjoyed this semester with you guys. Let me know if you need anything. I'll talk to you later.